Howdy, y'all. On May 1st of 1703, Peter the Great himself landed in a small Swedish seaport town of Nyen on the Neva River. However, within a few years, Peter the Great was outlawing stonemasonry anywhere else in Russia, just so every mason himself would have to come to Nyen. What did Nyen become? None other than the great old world city of St. Petersburg, which we will be discussing in great detail while looking at the oldest known photographs. I want to start this video by first addressing yesterday's video, where we talked about the different H blocks and things like that that were found in Pumapunku, Bolivia. Now, the consensus in the comments of that video seemed to indicate that many of you believe that these were in fact manufactured, but manufactured in the sense that some sort of polymer was poured into place, into a mold, to create these massive stone blocks. And I tend to agree, or at least I can see how that argument can be one that we could really end on when we find out the truth, which is what we're all looking for here. But in today's video, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different on the other side of the world, and that is St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, like I mentioned briefly just a bit earlier, I'm not going to focus too much on the history as the history books have it written, because one thing, we don't have many translations into English that are very thorough, at least to the point that I was able to find any details that I found truly revealing. And the other being that the main focus of this video for me is going to be these 100 or more quote-unquote photochrome images that were taken in the 1800s in St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, photochrome essentially is a color photograph that was taken in the 1800s, or a photograph that was able to be converted into very rich color. These are absolutely beautiful images from the old world, from the 1800s, that we rarely see in any city around the world. So for them to be taken in this beautiful city of St. Petersburg is something that was really interesting to me. Now, another thing that is really interesting to me is I found some depictions of what is said to be St. Petersburg in the year 1700, or right around the turn of the century going into the year 1700. Now, when you look at these images, a lot stands out to me. One, before I began looking into the oldest history of St. Petersburg, I would have been under the impression, just based off of my other old world history that I've looked into, that some sort of Tartarian representation would have been in this area, some form of the Mongol Empire or the Golden Horde or something like that. But instead, we are actually told it is a Nordic or a Viking or a Swedish land that was St. Petersburg before the Russians ended up taking it over. And I found that to be very interesting as well, because we've already made in so many videos, not just mine, but literally everybody else's that also looks into this old world content, we can constantly find ties between these large Viking-like individuals, these large burial mounds, and then these feats of architecture that we see all throughout the world. So to understand that apparently this area of St. Petersburg, before it was captured by Peter the Great, was actually a really massive town for a Swedish empire known as the city of Nyen, I just found that to be really fascinating right off the get-go. And another thing, we also have artistic depictions of a battle going on in this city of Nyen, or in this city that would become St. Petersburg. And this battle, which is taking part on the sea or in the water with boats and with ships, when you zoom in on this image, you can actually see in the background on the coastline a building which appears much like a modern day cathedral, except it is absolutely massive. It appears to be at least a quarter-mile long, and you have to wonder what other buildings like that existed in the old world St. Petersburg. We absolutely have this massive building. We have what looks to be like massive factories that are on the shoreline of this old, what they call Swedish city that then became St. Petersburg. Now, the question becomes, when Peter the Great came and conquered this area, whether he did by war or behind the scenes by trade, how much of these old Swedish buildings actually became St. Petersburg? As we know, a lot of the time we can take the foundations of these old ruined buildings, and when we look deeper, we actually find that there were pre-existing structures that date back much further than we earlier had predicted. Something that was also interesting, and something I did not know about Peter the quote great, I had always read about him with a little bit of interest, as according to the new calendar that Peter put into place for Russia, him and I share a birthday. So he was always someone I was interested in, at least as a historical figure. However, when I read about how he created this city of St. Petersburg, or how he inherited this city of St. Petersburg, I was a little bit shocked, to say the least, when I read that Nien itself began as an absolutely massive star fort city that was apparently built by this tribe of the Swedish people. And yet, once Peter the Great came in, he absolutely decimated that star fort to create his own, the Peter and Paul Fortress that you see here today. Now, while this was being done, the whole area around this star fort was drained. All of the water was drained. It was turned into a marshland that was then built on top of. Meanwhile, serfs, or people put into serfdom, were then continually taken from what we are told is Nien and the surrounding area, and forced to build out the city of St. Petersburg. We are told that conditions were so poor and the death rate amongst these workers, amongst the serfs, was so high that they were bringing in tens of thousands of new workers every single month. Now, what I found most interesting about this is, if you begin to look at who was actually part of the architecture groups and who was part of the Russian army and the Russian navy and the growing Russian forces at the time, you'll find that it actually consisted of a lot of people from opposing sides, opposing countries, people that would end up defecting away from their homeland to join the Russian forces. And I found that to be very interesting, because when we read about all of this massive construction, we're told that it was built mainly by the serfs, or by people that were basically working to achieve their freedom and to try and achieve Russian citizenship. But in a lot of other historical opinions, this was simply just another form of slavery. And at the same time, we can have these ancient kingdoms that once resided here, whether they're Tartarian or another nation, and they're coming back to the same areas they built, and now they have to live there basically in squalor. Now, if we try and look at this from a slightly different perspective, and the same perspective that you're probably thinking about right now if you're familiar with this sort of content, and if we refer to the unclassified or declassified documents that the CIA released about the history of Tartary and Russia, and how Russia essentially rewrote the entire history of Tartary to make it seem like the Tartarians never built anything in all of this whole region of Russia, when realistically it is estimated that the Tartarians contributed at least 30 to 50% of all of the construction that is in Russia today, or at least the foundations for these cities. When we refer to documents like that, and then we begin reading that Peter the Great was bringing in all of these people as serfs, but as they were serving their serfdom, they were all dying, we can also recalculate that statement as basically Peter the Great was attempting to wipe out all of these cultures and erase their history, while meanwhile making them basically put new facades, new faces on their old, ancient, holy structures. It's one of the ugliest things in history that I think I've ever read, and the more I begin to read about it, the more sickening it becomes. Again, I like to point out all the other facts that people in the comments point out, because many times when you say these things in the comments, I tend to agree with you, or at the most, I can empathize with you and I can see where you're coming from with these ideas. Now, of course, in St. Petersburg, soon after Peter the Great took over in the early 1700s, by the mid 1700s, we have a series of great fires that destroyed all of the original old world buildings in St. Petersburg. So, is that a coincidence? Maybe. Is it a tragedy? Definitely. But then we fast forward again about another 100 years or so. So we have 100 years there where many of the old world buildings, the original buildings from the 1700s, and the ones that could have been from a Tartarian empire or from a previous Swedish empire or any combination of the two, we have a lot of those buildings being burned, but many of the biggest and the largest still survived through the 1800s. That is up until about the time of photography. Then when photography came around, basically leaving evidence behind that couldn't be refuted, we have another great fire that occurred in St. Petersburg. And this one was massive. And this one burned large parts of the city. And this one destroyed a large portion of any of the old world, possibly Tartarian buildings that still remained. Now, when we look at the 1800s, especially the mid 1800s, as a time of possible reset, something we see in almost every major city. And if you don't believe me, or if you haven't watched a lot of my videos or anybody else's videos on the subject matter, you'll find that great fires occurred in some of the largest cities, in some of the largest buildings in those cities. Whether those buildings were built out of complete stone masonry, they still somehow burned. And that's something that's always been interesting, but that's for another video. However, when we consider when this reset could have hit Russia or could have been completed in Russia, we're looking at the mid 1800s. That's when we see that this final great fire occurred, but also in the mid 1800s, beginning in the year of 1812, right after Russia had their largest, or one of their largest, military victories ever over France, we have a slew of different monuments and massive architectural achievements being built all throughout Russia at this time. Now, like I said, this is after the year 1812. So only from 1812 until roughly the mid 1800s did these buildings stand, because like I said, the Great Fire of St. Petersburg ended up wiping out many of these original old world style buildings, even though at the time they were not that old. But if we take the official timeline out of play, these could have been some of the original Tartarian, Swedish advanced civilization buildings, or at least buildings that were built on top of those foundations. However, at the same time, we have all of the serfs, all of those people serving in serfdom, working for their freedom, working from these other cultures, those that are coming from Tartar, and those that are coming from Sweden, and coming from Norway, and coming from all these other places around Europe that were forced to work in Russia. They are all freed in the year 1861. Roughly the same time photography would come to the area of Russia, and roughly the same time the slaves would begin to fight for their freedom in America and other parts of the world. And this is where it gets really interesting, because we do have some people in the comments who I also love to read what you have to say, but they believe that some of these ancient advanced kingdoms, if they really were advanced and they really were separated with the rest of humanity, or separated from the rest of humanity, they believe that these kingdoms really were on their own and they didn't interact with modern day or common day man unless they really had to. And one thing I found interesting, at least when I considered that thought that some of the commenters on my channel have, and I read some of these facts that are given about St. Petersburg, one thing we are told is that while St. Petersburg and the whole castle, the whole area with all of these massive buildings was really thriving since Peter the Great went there in the early 1700s, there was absolutely no official bridges into St. Petersburg until the year 1850. St. Petersburg, Russia was seemingly designed and or built by whoever the original ruling class was to be divided off from the rest of the mainland, to be inaccessible, to be private, to be an area where no one could be reached unless they wanted to be reached. But there was no actual bridge for the most part to even get to St. Petersburg until the year 1850. Again, roughly around the time of the last reset, or around the time that all of the serfs were finally freed in Russia. So I found that to be another very revealing fact. Now, the last major aspect about this history of St. Petersburg that I want to talk about before we take some time to look and discuss these photographs and these photochrome prints from the 1800s, because mind you, again, these are all taken from before the year 1900. So I found that to be very interesting, very revealing as to what St. Petersburg looked like before it became more developed and more of the history was seemingly erased. But the last thing I want to talk about is these serfs. One more time. These serfs, I believe, are the Tartarians. I believe these are a ancient nation of people who were living civilized together. I'm not necessarily saying that I believe they are Tatars, and I'm not saying I believe that they are Swedish or Nordic or anything like that. I believe they are an amalgamation of all of these different groups of people who somehow found each other a long time ago and were able to live in places like this. However, as we can see in the history of Russia and in the history really all around the world, where we can find all of these same sort of ancient kingdoms that we are constantly questioning, there's always something in the late 1800s that followed some sort of war that then leads to famine, whether it be a Dust Bowl in America, or in the case of in Russia, we have another great famine that seemed to happen every single winter that brought these same people, these same serfs that were let go to freedom. They came right back to the cities in which they built, the same cities that if they were Tartarians or if they were once the rulers of those cities, they came back to their very own kingdoms only to be living there in squalor and build vast kingdoms. However, getting back into the facts of the matter as they are presented, we are told that when Russia freed every single one of the serfs that built St. Petersburg and all these other cities in the year 1861, shortly after that, nearly every single winter, there was a famine, and none of these serfs could find a place to live. None of these serfs could find anywhere to get food, and they all ended up flocking back to the major cities which they helped build, saying here in this narrative that St. Petersburg became one of the largest cities in all of Russia to house these serfs and feed them during the winter time. So I found that to be absolutely interesting, because many times, no matter what cities we're looking at, whether it's America or Europe or anywhere else, we see these pictures and these photographs that seem to indicate that there's evidence that people were essentially being shipped into these cities. They were being brought to these cities and left there and saying, here is your new life, start from the beginning. And when we look at this whole idea we're being presented with Russia, whether you believe it or not, we are told that we have all of these serfs who had advanced architectural designs that they could build with and that they were building with. And then basically Peter the Great came in. He put them into a form of slavery, and essentially it took them over 150 years just to gain their freedom. And this is only done for these same people who were enslaved to turn around and have to flock back to these cities to live in the insane asylums and the poor asylums and the other massive buildings that probably used to be their own kingdoms. I think that's absolutely tragic. I think it's absolutely revealing. I think it's the reason that the CIA talks about how the Tartarian history was rewritten. And I think it's one of the most important facets of all of world history that not a lot of people discuss at all. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, I wanted to just focus on these 125 or so old world images, especially the colorized photochrome images, but I did want to just briefly touch on the history of Russia and St. Petersburg going into the early 1900s. As a lot of you might know already, we do have the Bolshevik Revolution that occurred around 1917, and this ended the Romanov dynasty that had been ruling Russia for roughly 186 years prior to that. Essentially, the Bolsheviks, which were led by Lenin, went in and they stormed the Winter Palace, and then they also murdered the last of the Romanov dynasty, essentially ending the royal bloodline that ruled Russia. We have all of this new context that we can look at this history in. We can look at it from really all different sides, and we can wonder who really was in power to begin with. Who really did construct all of these amazing buildings? How many of these serfs were actually advanced people who had a lot more knowledge than we were led to believe? And I think I'm just going to leave the questions there. And for the remainder of the video, I believe I'm just going to chime out and let you look at these images yourself. I know. I receive a lot of comments sometimes where people say they wish I would narrate the whole video and I could discuss things with you the whole time. But I believe that would take away from the little details that you might see on your own without me chiming in and telling you what to look at. So I'd rather have you point out to me what you see in these images. I believe these are some of the most detailed images from the 1800s, and especially because they have color, this is one of the nicest ways I think that we can focus on the old world of St. Petersburg before it was destroyed. Because again, not to get into the 1900s history too much, but we also have with World War I and especially with World War II, this city was essentially completely destroyed. When we look at these oldest images, we can hope and we can fathom that some of these buildings could be hundreds of years old, and they could be coming from the ancient Tartarian or another advanced civilization. So let us together look through these. Let me know what stands out to you down below. I love you so much for being here with me and being part of the family. I love to share these ideas with you. You inspire me, and hopefully I inspire you too. So if you enjoy this video, please hit those thumbs up, please hit the subscribe, and share this video with anyone you think would enjoy. Part of me wants to believe that you can definitely tell that St. Petersburg is an old world monumental city just by all these different, almost awkward looking monuments that we have all around the city. All of the open area, as well as the different roadways that were created, these different horse-drawn carriageways that were basically put into place, seemingly dug out from below these layers of mud. We look at earlier photographs, earlier depictions of St. Petersburg, and we can see that the streets are very much aligned perfectly, and they appear to be built with some sort of brickwork, some sort of blockwork. Now, you can still see the same blockwork in later photographs. However, much of it appears to be dug out at this point, or once covered up with mud and now being reused and revitalized. Like the area was basically put into ruins and then gentrified once again. But I digress. Something that's really revealing to me, though, was this photograph, said to be one of the oldest in this entire collection. This is not a photochromatic picture. However, we do see multiple relics that appear to be from an entirely different sort of kingdom, just being housed deep inside a castle. And while we all like to discuss a good dome every now and again, it is rare that we see ancient old world cathedrals like this that are built with so many domes on top. That is something that we usually see in buildings that serve as mosques. We see it very often in the Middle East. However, we also see it here in Russia as well. And this goes along with Peter the Great's whole idea, his whole plan of converting. He seemed to convert anything that didn't fit his narrative into something that did, and he simply rewrote the history. Now, many times that would be considered to be a conspiracy theory, but when you look into the history of Russia and the things that Peter the Great did and is proud of, and the history books seem to be proud of, it really does indicate that anything that was Tartarian, or anything that was Swedish, anything that was Celtic, anything that reminded Peter the Great of any other great civilization, even Indian as a civilization, or anything from the east or more south. He converted all of these buildings into ones that he could use as a representation of his kingdom, St. Petersburg. Now, just to show the dichotomy that you have in St. Petersburg at this time, we have photographs of really untouched forest land, but at the same time, and admittedly, this is not the clearest picture in the world, but we do have this absolutely massive panoramic shot of St. Petersburg showing you just how large the city was and just how many of these old world factory style or Tartarian style or just simply brick built style buildings existed all throughout the land of St. Petersburg, as well as the old domed buildings, which many times we are told these are places of worship, as well as the hussars and things like that that appeared to be guarding the city at all time. There is a melting pot constantly at play in St. Petersburg, where we're not exactly sure which influence can be the one to be trusted when we read the history. There's so much that came into play here that we have to at least question what we are seeing. But I do find it fascinating that we have these high definition, colorized photographs from the 1800s. So let's sit back and enjoy, and let me know what stands out to you in the comments down below. Also, just to wrap up the video, I know you probably didn't think I would chime back in, but just for a second here, one of the things I discovered when looking into St. Petersburg is that they had the apparently world's first firefighter convention that was held in St. Petersburg, basically going over all the greatest and newest techniques for fighting fires. And these are just a couple images said to be taken at this event that occurred in the late 1890s. And another interesting aspect to me that really stood out here and really shows the influence that Old World Tartaria or Old World Russia really had on the rest of the world is the idea of Circassian beauties. If you've watched any of my other videos, this is a topic I've mentioned before, but essentially we have all different beauty products, some of the first beauty products ever marketed in the entire world, as well as traveling acts that would travel all across the world, essentially saying that Circassian women were some of the most beautiful women in the world and they possessed the abilities of goddesses. Now, Circassia is just another area in deep Russia or in the former Tartarian Empire. Now, these women had very unique bodily features, but they also had very light skin and very dark hair. Now, we have letters from people like P.T. Barnum who basically admit that any woman could be transformed into a Circassian beauty, but that's only for the American market. When we read into the history of the ballet within the Russian market, more specifically for the royalty that resided in St. Petersburg, we start to get an idea of where the Circassian beauty really came from, because we are told many, if not most, of the earliest and most successful ballet dancers within the St. Petersburg Ballet were considered to be Circassian beauties. Now, I don't know if any of you will remember this. Hopefully at least one or two of you will know what article I'm talking about, but roughly 2 to 3 years ago, an article began to circulate on the internet, and this article was either from the late 1800s or the early 1900s, and it was discussing a quote-unquote Circassian beauty. Now, what was interesting about her is that she was able to not only do the ballet dancing that made the St. Petersburg and Russia area so famous, and these dances themselves, they could have stemmed from an ancient culture, but she was actually able to speak in the ancient tongue. She was able to speak and sing in Tartarian. Now, modern day scholars will tell you that ancient Tartarian was likely nothing more than a form of Mongolian or something similar to what the Huns used to speak. However, when we look at even older documents, there seems to be a multitude of references to how advanced and difficult the Tartarian culture and language were to understand and speak. The Tartarian language was said to look the same and be able to be read from all angles. So to be able to sing in that dialect shows that even up until the early 1900s, there was those residing in and around the Russia area that still were holding true to old Tartarian practices. And I found that to be very interesting. But hopefully you enjoyed these 125 or so old world, the oldest pictures of St. Petersburg. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments down below. If you haven't already, please hit the thumbs up and share this video, because that's the only way for this channel to grow. I know a lot of you have been trying to reach out and let me know that you haven't been able to get through to me. Sometimes the algorithm is a little bit funky, but we're looking to fight through that. And I'm just looking to share all of these beautiful images and all of this awesome relevant information everywhere that I can. So if you can help me with that, I would appreciate it more than anything. I love making these videos for you. You guys are my family, and I can't wait to see you on the next video.